Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy Space Channel. There is a moon circling Jupiter, where the ground itself never stops moving. It is called Io, and by every honest measure, it is the most violent world in the solar system. More than 400 volcanoes burn across its surface at once, and fountains of molten rock climb hundreds of kilometers into the dark above it. Lakes of liquid stone turn their crusts over in the open, while the solid ground itself rises and falls like a slow tide, again and again, and never rests. Tonight we trace what could keep a world the size of our own moon burning so fiercely, and why all that fury rests, in the end, on something almost gentle. If you find these quiet explorations worth your time, a like or a subscribe helps the channel reach others who would enjoy them too. Thank you for being here. But for the next couple of hours, none of this is anything you need to carry. The fire is far away, and it asks nothing of you. Settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow and deepen. Let the day fade gently away behind you. Let's begin. Part 1. A world the size of our moon. There is a world circling Jupiter that never holds still. It is called Io, and by every fair measure, it is the most violent place in the solar system. Its surface is torn open by hundreds of volcanoes at once. Fountains of molten rock climb hundreds of kilometers into the dark above it. The ground itself rises and falls, again and again, as if the whole world were slowly breathing. Nothing on Io stays the same for long, and nothing on it ever truly rests. And yet the strange part is how familiar Io would look at first glance. It is almost exactly the size of our own moon, only a little larger, the fourth largest moon anywhere around the sun. If you set it beside the pale, quiet moon we know, the two would seem like near twins in size. But there the likeness ends. Our moon is a still, grey, cratered relic, unchanged for ages. Io is its restless opposite, molten and loud, and forever remaking its own face. It is worth sitting for a moment with that contrast, because it is the thread that runs through everything that follows. The same size and the opposite temperament. One world frozen in time, the other unable to stop moving. Tonight we will work slowly through how a moon so much like ours in size became so utterly unlike it in nature, and what quiet force could possibly keep a world this small burning so fiercely for so long. Io orbits very close to Jupiter, far closer than our moon orbits the Earth, though Jupiter is an immensely larger world to circle. It completes one full trip around the giant planet in well under 2 Earth days, racing along its path at a brisk pace. And like our moon, it is locked in place, turning so that the same face always points toward Jupiter. One side of Io forever watches the planet. The other forever faces away into open space. From the surface of Io, Jupiter would fill the sky in a way nothing fills our sky. It would hang there enormous and banded, many times wider than the full moon looks to us, and it would never move. Because Io always shows the same face to the giant, Jupiter would simply sit in one fixed place overhead, turning its cloud bands slowly, while the stars and the sun wheeled past behind it. The volcanoes would burn beneath that unmoving, swollen planet, lit faintly by its reflected light. Io is also the densest moon known anywhere around the sun, and that single fact tells us a great deal. A high density means a world made mostly of rock and metal, with very little of the ice that fills so many of the outer moons. Most of the moons this far from the sun are abundant in frozen water, layered with ice, sometimes hiding oceans beneath their shells. Io is the dry exception. It is stone and metal nearly through and through, and the reason it lost its ice is a quiet part of its story that we will come to later. The surface of Io is one of the youngest in the whole solar system. On most worlds, the passing ages leave a record written in craters, the slowly accumulating scars of impacts over billions of years. Our moon is covered in them. Io is almost entirely smooth of craters, and not because it has escaped being hit. It is smooth because its surface is constantly buried under fresh material, repaved by eruption after eruption, faster than craters can build up. In many regions, the ground you would stand on is younger than the oldest human cities. When you gather these facts together, a picture begins to form before we have even reached the volcanoes themselves. Here is a rocky world the size of our moon, locked beneath an unmoving giant, dry where its neighbors are icy, and so endlessly active that it erases its own history as quickly as it is written. Every one of those traits points back to a single source of energy hidden inside it, an engine unlike anything that drives our own familiar moon. That engine is the real subject of tonight's slow journey. The volcanoes, the fountains, the painted ground, the mountains pushed up toward the sky, the thin air that freezes and falls, the ring of glowing gas that Io feeds into the space around Jupiter. All of it traces back to one quiet, patient force. And once you understand that force, the most violent world in the solar system begins to seem, strangely, like one of the most orderly. So let us begin where Io itself begins, with the thing that keeps it burning. Io takes its name from an old story, from a figure of myth, a mortal caught up in the affairs of the gods of the sky. The other large moons of Jupiter carry names from the same family of tales, and together the four of them have been known for 4 centuries as a small set, the brightest companions of the giant. Among that set, Io is the innermost, the one that orbits closest to the planet, and that closeness is the first hint of why it behaves so differently from its more distant, icier siblings. Because Io is locked with the same face, always turned toward Jupiter, its day and its year are the same length. One turn of the moon on its axis takes exactly as long as one trip around the planet, a little under 2 Earth days. There is no separate sunrise marching around Io the way the sun moves across our sky each morning. Instead, the giant hangs fixed overhead on the near side, while the faint and distant sun rises and sets slowly against that unmoving backdrop, lighting the colored ground in pale, shifting tones as the moon carries it around. For now, simply hold the image of it. A familiar grey size wrapped in unfamiliar fire. A moon that should, by rights, be as still and cold as our own, and is instead the loudest, brightest, most molten world we know. The closer we look at Io, the stranger and the more beautiful that contradiction becomes. And it all rests on a single thread of gravity, stretched taut between 3 moons and a giant. Part 2. The engine of fire. To understand why Io burns, we have to understand what feeds the fire. On Earth, volcanoes are driven by heat that has 2 sources. Some of it is warmth left over from the planet's birth, still slowly leaking out from the center after billions of years. The rest comes from the gentle decay of radioactive elements buried in the rock, each one releasing a tiny trickle of heat as it decays. Together, these keep Earth's interior warm enough to melt rock here and there, and so we have our volcanoes, scattered thinly across the planet and across time. Io runs on something else entirely, and it is far more relentless. Io's heat does not come mainly from its birth or from decaying elements inside it. It comes from outside, from the gravity of Jupiter, delivered through the shape of Io's orbit. The process has a name. It is called tidal heating, And while it warms several worlds in the solar system a little, on Io it is turned up to an extreme that exists nowhere else we know. The first piece of the puzzle is that Io does not travel alone. Moving outward from Jupiter, the next two large moons after Io are Europa and Ganymede, and the three of them are bound together in a precise and lasting rhythm. For every 4 orbits that Io makes around Jupiter, Europa makes exactly 2, and Ganymede makes exactly 1. 4, then 2, then 1. This tidy relationship, where orbits line up in whole numbers, is what astronomers call a resonance. A resonance like this has a quiet power to it. Because the 3 moons keep this exact ratio, they return to the same arrangement over and over, lining up in the same places again and again. And each time they line up, they tug on one another with their gravity at the same points in their orbits. A single tug would mean almost nothing. But the same small tug, repeated in the same place, orbit after orbit, year after year, builds into something that shapes the whole system. The moons keep time with each other, and that timing will not let Io settle down. Here is why that matters. Left entirely to itself, Io's orbit around Jupiter would slowly round out into a near-perfect circle. A moon on a circular orbit stays at a constant distance from its planet, feels a steady, unchanging pull, and is not flexed or squeezed. Such a moon grows quiet inside and cools over time. If Io were alone, that is exactly what would happen to it. It would become another still, cold world. But Io is not allowed to round out its orbit. The steady, rhythmic pulls from Europa and Ganymede keep stretching it back into a slightly elliptical shape, a path that is not quite a circle. The effect is small in the numbers, only a slight stretch, but it is enough. Because the orbit is not a perfect circle, Io's distance from Jupiter changes as it goes around. Sometimes it swings a little closer, sometimes a little farther, on every single orbit, without rest. Now bring Jupiter's gravity into the picture, because Jupiter is no ordinary planet. It is the largest world the Sun ever made, with a pull so strong it dominates this entire region of space. When Io swings a little closer to that giant, Jupiter's gravity grips it more tightly. When Io drifts a little farther away, the grip eases. And this changing grip does something remarkable to the body of the moon. It squeezes and stretches Io as a whole, raising tides not in any ocean, for Io has none, but in the solid rock itself. The numbers here are quietly astonishing. The solid surface of Io rises and falls by as much as 100 meters with each pass around Jupiter. Picture the entire crust of a world swelling outward and sinking back by the height of a tall building, not once, but continuously, on a cycle that repeats every couple of Earth days and has repeated for an immense span of time. The ground of Io heaves like a slow, stony tide, and it never stops. All of that bending has to go somewhere. When you flex any solid material over and over, friction inside it turns the motion into warmth. You can feel a small version of this if you bend a piece of metal back and forth until it grows warm at the crease. Io is being bent on the scale of an entire world by the gravity of the largest planet around the Sun, without pause. The friction of that endless flexing is the heat. It softens the rock far inside, melts it, and sends it searching for any path upward. The paths it finds are the volcanoes. The total amount of heat this produces is hard to hold in the mind. Across each patch of its surface, Io pours out many times more internal warmth than the Earth does, and across the whole moon, it releases something on the order of 100 trillion watts from within. This is not the leftover warmth of birth slowly fading. It is a fire actively fed, moment by moment, by the geometry of the orbit and the pull of the giant. It helps to feel this in something close at hand. If you take a length of wire or a paperclip and bend it back and forth quickly, the metal grows warm at the bend, warm enough to feel against the lip. Nothing is burning. The warmth comes purely from the bending, from the friction of the material working against itself. Io is being bent in just this way, only on the scale of an entire world, by the gravity of the largest planet around the sun, on a cycle that never pauses. The warmth at the bend, scaled up to a moon, is enough to melt rock. The two outer moons, Europa and Ganymede, are flexed by this same kind of process, and they too carry warmth because of it. But they orbit farther from Jupiter, where the giant's grip is gentler, and so their flexing is milder, and their interiors stay cooler. Europa, the next moon out, holds its warmth quietly beneath a shell of ice, enough perhaps to keep a hidden sea liquid, but nowhere near enough to set the surface burning. Io, sitting closest to the giant and held on its stretched orbit by the others, receives the flexing at full strength. The same family of forces warms 3 moons, and only the innermost is driven all the way to fire. And because the resonance among the 3 moons is stable and self-sustaining, this engine does not switch off. It does not run down the way a leftover heat would. As long as Io, Europa, and Ganymede keep their fourfold rhythm, the flexing continues, and the heat keeps coming. Io has very likely been burning, in one place or another, for a great stretch of the solar system's history. It is not a world that erupted once and fell quiet. It is a world held permanently in the grip of a slow, patient squeeze, answering that squeeze with fire. Part 3. The 400 mouths. With that engine running beneath it, Io's surface becomes the stage where all that hidden heat finally shows itself. And it shows itself everywhere. Io carries more than 400 known volcanic centers across its face, and at any given moment, dozens of them are erupting. No other world in the solar system comes close to this. Volcanism is not a rare event on Io, scattered here and there. It is the single dominant force that has shaped nearly every feature you can see. It helps to compare this with Earth for a moment, gently and without alarm. Our planet is the only other rocky world with active volcanoes on a large scale, and we tend to think of Earth as a volcanic place. But Earth's eruptions are spread thinly across its surface and across long stretches of time. A given volcano might sleep for centuries between eruptions. On Io, the eruptions are not the exception interrupting a long quiet. They are the constant condition of the world. If you could watch Io closely for a single week, you would see new eruptions begin, old ones fade, and the map of the surface quietly rearrange itself. Most of Io's volcanoes do not look like the tall, cone-shaped mountains we usually picture when we think of a volcano. The classic Earth volcano builds itself up into a peak as lava and ash pile around a central vent. Io's volcanoes are mostly the opposite shape. They are broad, flat-floored pits, often many tens of kilometers across, where the ground has collapsed inward over an emptied chamber of magma below. These features have a name of their own. They are called paterae, and they are scattered across Io by the hundreds. A patera forms when molten rock drains away beneath the surface, and the unsupported ground sinks down into the gap it leaves behind. The result is a wide, shallow depression with a dark, freshly paved floor, often glowing faintly with heat. Some of these pits are simply quiet for a time. Others hold churning lakes of molten rock open to the sky. The largest of them stretch 200 kilometers from one rim to the other, broad enough to swallow a small country whole, floored with cooling and reheating lava. When you map where these volcanic pits sit, they are spread widely across the whole moon, from the regions near the equator to the high latitudes near the poles. This even spread is itself a clue about what lies beneath, because it suggests that heat is rising toward the surface across nearly the entire world at once, not just in a few isolated zones. The fire is not confined to one restless quarter of Io. It is, in a sense, everywhere, with one mouth opening here as another closes there. The floors of the active paterae are among the hottest places on the surface, paved with dark, fresh lava that has only recently emerged from below. Around them spread broad plains coated in the pale debris of older eruptions, the cooled and frozen leftovers of fountains and flows that have since gone quiet. The boundary between the dark, warm pits and the bright, cold plains is one of the most common sights on Io, repeated hundreds of times across its surface, each one a small record of where the heat last broke through. Because there are so many of these vents, Io is never entirely dark to the instruments that watch it in heat rather than in light. Seen by its warmth, Io glows in hundreds of points at once, a scattering of hotspots spread across the whole globe, each one a place where the interior is pressing its fire up to the surface. Some of these hot spots flare brighter for a while and then dim. Others hold steady for years. The overall pattern shifts slowly, like a field of embers that never quite goes out and never quite settles. It is tempting to imagine all of this as chaos, but it is better understood as a kind of steady overflow. The engine inside Io produces heat faster than the moon can quietly hold it, and so that heat is constantly finding release through whatever opening it can. 400 volcanoes is simply what it looks like when a world the size of our moon is fed more internal warmth than it can contain. The number is large, but the cause behind it is single and simple. And so the volcanoes of Io are not a collection of separate, unrelated mountains, the way we might catalogue the volcanoes of Earth. They are more like the many vents of one enormous world-spanning furnace, each opening drawing on the same great store of melted rock kept warm by the flexing of the whole moon. To understand any one of Io's volcanoes is to understand all of them, because they are all, in the end, the same fire, finding many different ways out. The volcanoes of Io carry names drawn from figures of fire and the sun and thunder, gathered from the myths of many different peoples around the world. This was a fitting choice, for there is no other world where such names could be spread so generously. On Earth, the number of volcanoes erupting at any one moment can be counted on one's fingers. On Io, the number is in the dozens at any given time, and the total of known volcanic centers runs into the hundreds, far more than enough to exhaust the fire deities of any single tradition. That count is not even fixed, because the moon keeps changing. New volcanic centers brighten where none had been noticed before, and others fall quiet and fade from view. Each careful look at Io finds the map a little altered from the last, a vent newly active here, an old hotspot dimmed there. The 400 is less a final tally than a snapshot of an ongoing process, a count of the mouths that happen to be known and watched, on a world that is forever opening new ones and closing old ones as the heat below seeks its endless release. In the parts that follow, we will look more closely at the forms that fire takes. The towering fountains that rise into the space above Io. The open lakes of molten rock with their cracking, sinking crusts. The flows that bury the plains and the colors they leave behind. But it is worth holding on to this first picture as we go. Wherever we look on Io, whatever shape the eruption takes, we are always looking at the same thing. We are watching a small world let go of more heat than it can keep, gently and endlessly, through 400 open mouths. Part 4. The fountains that reach towards space. Among all of Io's displays, the most extraordinary are its plumes. A plume is a towering fountain of gas and dust that rises from an erupting vent and climbs far above the surface, higher than any eruption on Earth could ever reach. Where Earth's volcanic plumes billow and tumble in our thick air, Io's plumes do something stranger and more graceful, because the conditions on Io are so different from anything we know at home. Two things shape the way an Io plume behaves. The first is gravity, which on Io is only about 1/6 of Earth's, the same gentle pull we know from our own moon. The second is the near absence of air. Io's atmosphere is so thin that for the purposes of a rising plume, the material is climbing into something very close to empty space. With weak gravity to slow it, and almost no air to push against it, the erupted material does not form a churning cloud. It rises in smooth, clean arcs, spreading outward as it climbs. The result is one of the loveliest shapes in the solar system. An Io plume rises from its vent and fans out into an enormous, symmetrical dome, like a great umbrella or a fountain frozen in a single, graceful gesture. The material climbs, slows, curves over at the top, and falls gently back toward the ground in a wide, even curtain all around the vent. Because it is falling in such low gravity through such thin air, it comes down softly and lays itself across the surface in a broad ring, painting a perfect circle of fresh deposit on the ground below. The scale of these fountains is difficult to take in. The tallest of Io's plumes climb to heights of 300 kilometers and more above the surface. That is a fountain reaching far higher than the orbits where many spacecraft circle the Earth. If such a plume rose from the ground of our own world, it would tower far above everything in the sky we know. On Io, these fountains stand off the curved edge of the moon as faint, glowing domes of mist, visible from a great distance, hanging silently above the burning ground. Not all of Io's plumes are alike, and they tend to fall into two broad families that are worth understanding. The first family is made of the great, tall, faint fountains driven mostly by sulfur gases venting from very hot magma. These are the giants that reach the greatest heights. They are fainter to the eye because the material in them is spread so thin, but they are the ones that climb highest into space and lay down the broadest rings of colored material, sometimes painting circles many hundreds of kilometers wide upon the plains. The second family is smaller and dustier, and it forms in a different way. When fresh, hot lava flows out across ground that is coated in frozen sulfur dioxide, the heat strikes the frost and flashes it instantly into gas. That sudden burst of gas launches dust and frozen grains upward into a plume. These plumes are shorter than the great sulfur fountains, but they have a remarkable quality. Because they are fed by lava creeping across the frosted ground, the plume can wander. As the front edge of the lava flow moves slowly across the surface, the plume rising from it moves too, drifting along like a fountain that walks. Some of these wandering plumes have stayed active for many years at a time, rising day after day as the lava beneath them advances. One such persistent fountain has been seen erupting again and again across decades of observation, so reliable in its activity that watchers came to expect it, the way one might expect a faithful, regularly performing spring. Its plume shifts its position over the years, tracing the slow path of the molten rock that feeds it, never quite in the same place twice, yet never truly stopping. When a plume falls back to the surface, it leaves a lasting mark, and these marks are some of the most distinctive features on Io. The fallout settles into rings and ovals of fresh material, often vividly colored, centered on the vent that produced them. A single large plume can lay down a ring so wide and so bright that it becomes one of the most recognizable markings on the entire moon, visible from far away as a great colored circle printed upon the plains. These rings slowly fade and are overwritten by new activity, so their very presence marks a vent that has erupted recently. There is something quietly hypnotic in the motion of an Io plume, even though no one has ever stood close enough to watch one rise. The material lifts from the vent, climbs in silence through the thin and frigid air, slows at the top of its arc, and drifts back down in a wide, soft curtain, settling onto the ground without a sound. There is no roar, no rush of wind, because there is almost no air to carry sound. The greatest fountains in the solar system rise and fall in near-perfect silence, over and over, in the cold light of the distant sun. The rings these plumes paint upon the ground are some of the surest signs of where Io has been active. When a tall fountain falls back in its wide, even curtain, it lays its material down in a near-perfect circle, centered on the vent, and these circles can span hundreds of kilometers. A single great plume can draw a ring so large and so distinctly colored that it becomes one of the most recognizable features on the entire moon. A vivid oval printed across the plains, slowly fading as the unstable colors within it relax over time. The greatest plumes reach heights that are difficult to set against anything in our ordinary experience. A fountain climbing 300 kilometers or more rises far above the altitudes where many of our own spacecraft circle the Earth. If such a thing stood upon our world, it would tower past everything we know in the sky and keep climbing. On Io, these fountains stand off the curve of the moon as faint, glowing domes, lifting silently into the dark. And the only reason they do not simply fly off into space entirely is that Io's gravity, weak as it is, still gently calls the material back down. And then, often, the fountain simply stops, and another begins somewhere else across the moon. The plumes of Io are not permanent. They open, they pour their material into the sky, they paint their rings upon the ground, and they close again, while new vents take up the work elsewhere. Watching Io over the years, one sees the fountains come and go like slow, bright breaths, each one lifting a little more of the moon's interior up into the space around it, then settling back into stillness as the next one quietly begins. Part 5. The Lakes of Molten Rock. Not all of Io's fire rises into fountains. Some of it simply pools and waits, gathered into open lakes of molten rock that lie upon the surface, exposed to the cold of space above them. These lava lakes are among the most remarkable features anywhere in the solar system, and Io holds the largest and most powerful of them. To picture one is to picture a broad pond of glowing liquid rock, perhaps 100 or 200 kilometers across, sitting in the floor of one of Io's wide volcanic pits. The largest of these molten lakes fills a patera roughly 200 kilometers from rim to rim, a single open expanse of lava, broad enough to cover an entire small nation. At times, this one feature alone radiates more heat than all of the active volcanoes on Earth combined. It is the most powerful volcanic center on the most volcanic world we know, and it does its work not by exploding, but by quietly holding an enormous surface of molten rock open to the sky, glowing steadily in the dark. A lava lake on Io behaves in a way that is both strange and oddly familiar. As the molten rock loses heat upward into space, a thin skin forms across the top, a dark crust of cooled and solidified lava, much like the skin that forms on cooling metal or on a pot of liquid left to stand. This crust is darker and cooler than the melt beneath it, and from a distance the lake appears as a dark oval lying in the bright surrounding terrain. But the crust is not stable, and this is what makes these lakes so extraordinary. The molten rock below is still churning, still being heated from beneath, and the dark crust on top is denser than the fresh melt. Over time, the crust cracks, tips, and founders, splitting apart and sinking back down into the lava that made it. As the old crust sinks, fresh glowing rock wells up to take its place, along the edges of the lake and through the widening cracks. The whole surface slowly turns itself over, swallowing its own skin and renewing its face. This overturning happens on a roughly regular cycle, and it can be watched from far away as a slow brightening and dimming of the lake. When the crust has mostly foundered and a great deal of fresh, hot lava is exposed, the lake glows brighter in the instruments that measure its heat. As a new crust forms and spreads across the surface, the lake dims again. Then the cycle repeats, the crust building, cracking, and sinking once more, on a rhythm that takes many months to complete. The lake breathes, in its own slow way, as steadily as the moon that holds it. Standing at the edge of such a lake, if anyone ever could, one would see a surface that looks almost solid, a dark plain stretching toward the far rim, broken here and there by glowing seams where the crust has split. Along those seams, and around the entire margin of the lake, the molten rock would shine through, a network of bright lines drawn across the dark. And every so often, with no warning and no sound, a great raft of the crust would tilt and slide beneath the melt, and a fresh stretch of glowing lava would open where it had been. These lakes are reminders that Io's violence is not always loud. We tend to imagine the most violent world in the solar system as a place of constant explosion, and there is plenty of explosive fountaining to be found. But some of Io's greatest outpourings of heat are quiet, steady, and almost still. A broad lake of molten rock, simply lying open beneath the giant planet, losing its warmth slowly to the dark and renewing itself from below. The power is immense, yet the scene is calm, a pool of fire holding perfectly still in the cold. The molten lakes also tell us something important about Io's interior, because to keep such a large surface of rock, liquid and open for long stretches of time, requires a steady supply of heat from below. These are not pools left over from a single eruption, slowly freezing. They are kept molten, sustained, fed from beneath by the same tidal warmth that drives everything else. A lava lake on Io is a window, in a sense, onto the heat constantly rising through the moon, a place where that heat lies open to view, rather than hidden under the crust. It is worth pausing on how rare this is. On Earth, persistent lava lakes are unusual and precious things, found at only a small handful of volcanoes, watched closely by those who study them. On Io, they are simply one of the ordinary forms the fire takes, scattered across the moon, some of them larger than anything Earth has ever held. What would be a once-in-a-generation marvel on our world is, on Io, just another glowing pond among many, turning its crust over patiently in the dark. The brightening and dimming of the largest lava lake follows a rhythm that takes many months to complete, and watching that rhythm has taught those who study Io a great deal about what lies beneath. The lake does not flare at random. It brightens as its crust founders and fresh lava is exposed, then dims steadily as a new crust forms and spreads, and then brightens again, on a cycle regular enough that its returns can be roughly anticipated. A feature that keeps such steady time must be fed by a steady supply of heat from below, and so the lake serves as a kind of slow, glowing gauge of the moon's inner warmth. There is a quiet resemblance, too, between a foundering lava lake and the slow workings of our own planet's surface. On Earth, great plates of crust are born, spread, and sink back into the interior over immense stretches of time, carrying the surface in a slow cycle of renewal. A lava lake on Io does something like this, in miniature and at speed, its dark crust forming, drifting, cracking, and sinking back into the melt below, fresh material welling up to replace it. It is plate movement, compressed into a single pond, played out across months rather than ages, open to view in the cold light of the giant. And so the lakes lie there, on a world that never stops moving, as close to stillness as Io ever comes. They crack and founder and renew, brighten and dim, breathe their slow molten breath beneath the unmoving giant overhead. They ask for no attention and receive almost none, glowing quietly through the long Ionian days and nights, the calm and steady center of the most violent world the sun has ever lit. Part 6. The hottest fire. The lava that flows and pools and fountains across Io is not all of one kind, and the differences between its kinds reveal something about how hot Io's fire can truly become. Some of what erupts on Io is sulfur and sulfur compounds, melted into bright flowing liquid by the heat below. This sulfur lava is relatively cool as molten material goes, and it carries much of the vivid color that makes Io so vivid to look upon. But the hottest of Io's eruptions are something else entirely. The hottest eruptions on Io are molten silicate rock, the same broad family of material that makes the lava of Earth's volcanoes. This is true stone, melted by the engine inside the moon and poured out across the surface. And here Io reveals one of its most remarkable secrets, because the temperatures measured at some of its hottest volcanic centers are higher than anything Earth produces in its eruptions today. Io's hottest lava is hotter than the hottest lava of the modern Earth. To find a parallel to Io's hottest fire on our own world, you have to look very far back in time. In the youth of the Earth, when the planet's interior ran hotter than it does now, certain eruptions produced lava at temperatures close to what Io reaches today. That kind of extremely hot, fast-flowing rock has not erupted on Earth for an immense stretch of time, since the distant ages when our own world was still young and hot inside. In a quiet sense, watching Io erupt is like looking back at the kind of volcanism the early Earth may once have known. This is a gentle and surprising bridge across time. The most violent world in the solar system, circling Jupiter right now, may be showing us something our own planet has long since left behind. The fast blazing rivers of superheated rock that once crossed the young Earth are gone here, cooled into the slower volcanism we know today. But out at Jupiter, fed by a different engine, that ancient style of fire still flows. Io is, in this one respect, a living window onto a chapter of Earth's story that ended long before anything was alive to witness it. When this hot silicate lava erupts, it can pour out in flows of extraordinary length. Freed onto the surface, the molten rock spreads across the plains, traveling tens and even hundreds of kilometers before it finally cools and hardens. These flows are broad sheets of fresh stone laid down across the older ground, and they are a major reason Io looks the way it does. Each new flow buries whatever lay beneath it, paving the surface over yet again with a clean layer of cooled rock. This endless burial is the answer to one of Io's quietest puzzles, the near-total absence of impact craters. Every world in the solar system is struck by debris over the ages, and on most worlds, those impacts leave craters that build up over billions of years, a slowly accumulating record of the bombardment. Io is struck just as often as its neighbors. But on Io, Any crater that forms is quickly paved over by fresh lava, buried beneath new flows and plume fallout, long before it can become part of a lasting record. The craters are erased almost as fast as they are made. Because of this, Io's surface carries almost no memory of its past. Where our moon's face is a museum of impacts reaching back billions of years, Io's face shows only the recent present, the eruptions and flows of a geologically short span of time. The whole surface is, in effect, young, continuously refreshed, wiped clean, again and again. To look at Io is to see not its history, but its current moment, a snapshot of a world caught in the middle of remaking itself. The rate of this resurfacing is brisk enough that it would be noticeable even on human timescales if we could watch closely enough for long enough. Fresh material is laid down across the moon quickly enough that, over a span short by the standards of geology, the entire surface can be substantially renewed. Features appear, brighten, darken, and vanish. A dark flow that is prominent in one close look may be faded and half buried by the next. Io does not hold still long enough to be fully mapped, because the map is always changing beneath the mapmaker. All of this hot, flowing rock also helps explain the heat that Io radiates into space. The superheated silicate lava carries enormous warmth up from the interior and spreads it across the surface, where it glows and slowly cools, releasing its heat into the dark. Multiply this across hundreds of active centers and countless flows, and you begin to see how a moon the size of ours can pour out as much internal heat as it does. The hot fire is not only dramatic to look at, it is the main way Io carries its inner warmth up and out. The temperatures involved are worth holding for a moment, gently. Ordinary molten rock erupts on Earth at well over 1,000 degrees, hot enough to glow orange and yellow. Some of Io's hottest volcanic centers appear to run hotter still, hinting at a kind of lava unusually full of magnesium, the sort of fast, blazing rock that requires an especially hot interior to produce. This is the variety that has not flowed on Earth since the planet's distant youth, and its apparent presence on Io tells us the moon's interior is being heated to a degree our own world left behind long ago. When such hot lava is freed onto the surface, its great heat lets it flow far before it stiffens and stops. The flows can stretch for tens and even hundreds of kilometers across the plains, spreading in broad, thin sheets that cool from the edges inward. Each of these flows is a fresh layer of stone laid over the old, and because they are so long and so frequent, they do much of the work of paving the moon. Walk across Io's plains, if anyone ever could, and one would be walking across. Flow upon flow of cooled rock, each one younger than the last, the whole surface a stack of recent fire. And yet, for all the heat of these flows, the surface of Io as a whole is bitterly cold. Away from the active vents and the glowing lakes, the ground sits far below freezing, chilled by the great distance from the sun. The hot lava emerges into a frigid world, glows fiercely for a time, and then cools and joins the cold plains around it. Io is a study in extremes, held side by side, rivers of rock hotter than anything on Earth, flowing across ground colder than any winter our world has known, the fire and the cold sharing the same quiet surface beneath the giant. Part 7. The Painted World. Seen from space, Io is one of the most colorful worlds the sun has ever lit. Its surface is a mottled spread of yellow, orange, red, white, brown, black, and faint touches of green, arranged in patches and rings and streaks across the whole globe. The colors are so unusual, so unlike the grays and rusts of most rocky worlds, that the first people to see Io clearly reached for comparisons to food to describe it. It is a world that looks, at first glance, almost painted by hand. All of that color comes from a single thread of chemistry, and that thread is sulfur. Sulfur and its compounds, especially a substance called sulfur dioxide, coat Io's surface in endless variation. Sulfur is a remarkable material for this because it takes on strikingly different colors depending on how it has been heated, how quickly it has cooled, and what form it has settled into. A world awash in sulfur, constantly heated by volcanoes and frozen by the cold, becomes a world awash in color. The yellows and oranges that dominate much of Io are ordinary sulfur in its more stable forms, laid down across the plains as cooled deposits. This is the base color of the moon, the warm, pale tone that covers the broad regions between the volcanic centers. It is sulfur that has erupted or been carried out as gas, settled onto the surface, and cooled into its familiar yellow state, blanketing the ground in the soft colors we associate with the element itself. The reds are more dramatic, and they tell a story of recent activity. When sulfur is heated to high temperatures and then frozen very quickly, it can lock into unstable forms that carry a vivid red color. These red deposits are often found in fresh rings around active plume vents, where hot sulfur gas has erupted and then frozen onto the cold ground around it. But these red forms are not permanent. Over time, they slowly relax back into the more stable yellow forms, fading as they go. So a bright red ring on Io is a mark of something recent, a sign that a vent has erupted not long ago. The whites and pale grays come from sulfur dioxide, the same compound that makes up most of Io's thin air. On the cold surface, sulfur dioxide freezes into a bright frost, settling over the older, cooler ground like a dusting of pale snow. These frost deposits brighten broad regions of the moon and lie especially thick where the surface has been quiet long enough for the frost to gather. Where you see white on Io, you are most often seeing frozen sulfur dioxide, the moon's own exhaled gas settled back onto the ground as frost. The blacks are the hottest and freshest places of all, the dark floors of active volcanic pits and the newest flows of silicate lava. This fresh dark rock has only recently emerged from below and has not yet been covered over by pale sulfur or sulfur dioxide frost. The dark patches mark where the fire is most active, and they stand out sharply against the bright surrounding plains. As these flows cool and are slowly dusted with fallout over time, they too will fade toward the lighter tones, until the next eruption opens a fresh, dark wound nearby. Put all of these together, and Io's surface becomes a kind of living record, written in color. The pale yellow plains are the quiet background. The white frost marks the cold, still regions. The dark patches show where the fire burns now, and the fading red rings show where it burned recently. A single glance at Io's colors is a glance at the moon's recent activity, a map of where heat has lately broken through and where it has not. Nothing about the color is permanent, because nothing about Io is permanent. This is the quiet wonder of Io's painted surface. It is never finished. The colors shift as the eruptions move, as fresh dark lava emerges and old red rings fade and new frost settles and is buried again. The moon is constantly erasing and redrawing its own face, repainting itself in sulfur and shadow on a cycle that never completes. No portrait of Io stays accurate for long because the subject will not hold still. By the time one image is studied, the surface has already begun to change. There is something restful in that idea when you sit with it gently. Here is a world utterly unconcerned with permanence, a world that makes no effort to preserve its own appearance, that simply repaints itself over and over in the dark and lets each version go. The bright rings fade without protest. The dark flows cool and pale and vanish under frost. Io keeps no record, holds no grudge against time, asks nothing to last. It only changes, quietly and endlessly, beneath the slow-turning bands of the giant overhead. When Io was first seen clearly, the unusual mix of yellows, oranges, reds and whites struck observers as so unlike any other world that they reached, half in jest, for comparisons to food to capture it. The descriptions stuck because they were apt. No other body shows quite this palette, and the reason is that no other body wears so much sulfur, worked over so constantly by heat and cold. The colors are not a trick of the light or a flaw in the early images. They are real, and they are the true face of a world coated in the many forms that sulfur and its compounds can take. There are even faint greens to be found in places on Io, adding to the unusual range of its surface. These, like the reds, are thought to arise where sulfur has been altered by contact with heat and then frozen in an unusual state, or where it has mixed with other materials thrown out by the volcanoes. Like so much else on the Moon, the greens are not permanent. They belong to the same slow shifting of color that plays across the whole surface as fresh material is laid down, and older deposits relax, fade, and are buried, the Moon endlessly reworking its own strange and lovely complexion. And the colors are real information, not mere decoration, which matters for a world we can only watch from afar. Each shade is a clue, telling those who study Io what the surface is made of and how recently it has changed. The yellow is sulfur at rest. The red is sulfur, freshly frozen. The white is the Moon's frozen breath. The black is the open fire. To read Io's colors is to read its present state, the most violent world in the solar system describing itself, honestly and beautifully, in every shade it wears. Part 8. The mountains that were pushed up. Io is not only volcanoes and painted plains. Scattered across its surface are mountains, and some of them are towering, steep, and immense. More than 100 substantial mountains rise from Io's surface, many of them isolated blocks that climb sharply from the surrounding terrain, standing alone like great slabs tilted toward the sky. The tallest of them reaches a height of roughly 17 kilometers, about twice the height of the greatest mountain on Earth measured from the level of the sea. To stand near the base of such a mountain, if anyone ever could, would be to look up at a wall of rock climbing, far higher than any peak on our own world. These are not gentle, rolling hills. Many of Io's mountains are sharp-edged and steep-sided, great tilted plates of crust with faces that drop away in long, abrupt scarps. They are among the more startling features of the Moon, precisely because they seem at first to have nothing to do with the volcanism that defines everything else around them. And indeed, the surprising truth is that Io's mountains are mostly not volcanic at all. They are not built up from erupted lava the way a volcanic peak is built on Earth, layer by layer, around a vent. Io's mountains form in an entirely different way, and understanding that way means returning, once again, to the volcanism, but seeing it from a new angle. The mountains are not made by the eruptions directly. They are made by the consequences of so much eruption over so long a time. Here is how it works. Io's surface is constantly being buried under fresh material, eruption after eruption, flow after flow, plume fallout settling endlessly across the plains. Every new layer laid down on top presses the older layers beneath it downward and inward. Over a great span of time, This relentless burial squeezes the crust of the entire moon, compressing it under the steadily growing weight of everything piled on top. The crust is, in effect, being slowly crushed from above by the very activity that paves it. A crust, under that kind of steady compression, cannot simply absorb the squeeze forever. Eventually it fractures, splitting along great faults that run through the rock. And where it gives way, enormous blocks of crust are shoved upward along the fractures, thrust toward the sky as the surrounding material presses in. These uplifted, tilted blocks are Io's mountains, raised not by fire welling up, but by the sideways squeeze of a crust being endlessly buried and compressed. They are tilted paving stones, the size of mountains, pushed up at the edges as the floor beneath them is crowded. This origin explains some of the curious things about where Io's mountains sit. The mountains and the most active volcanoes tend to avoid one another, occupying different regions of the moon rather than mingling together. This makes a quiet kind of sense once you understand their origin. Where the crust is splitting open to let lava erupt, it is doing one thing. Where it is being shoved sideways and thrust up into peaks, it is doing another. The two processes are responses to the same pressures, but they express themselves in different places, and so the peaks and the pits keep a certain distance from each other. Many of Io's mountains show signs of slow collapse along their flanks. As these great tilted blocks stand exposed, their steep faces give way over time, shedding enormous landslides of crustal debris that spread out across the plains at their feet. In Io's low gravity, such a landslide would move differently than it would on Earth, the material traveling far and settling wide, spreading a broad apron of rubble around the base of the failing slope. The mountains are not permanent, any more than anything else on Io. They rise, they stand for a time, and they slowly come apart. It is worth dwelling on how strange and beautiful this arrangement is. The same endless volcanism that paves Io's surface and erases its craters is also, indirectly, building its mountains, by burying and compressing the crust until it fractures and heaves upward. Fire below, weight above, and between them a crust that responds by opening in some places and rising in others. The volcanoes and the mountains, which seem at first to be opposites, are in truth two answers to the same question. Two ways the crust copes with a world that never stops resurfacing itself. So Io's skyline, if it had observers, would hold both kinds of grandeur at once. There would be the broad, glowing pits and the towering plumes of the volcanic centers, and there would also be these immense tilted peaks, standing far higher than any mountain on Earth, throwing long shadows across the colored plains in the faint light of the distant sun. A country of fire and a country of stone, side by side, both of them shaped by the same patient engine flexing the moon from within. The steepness of Io's mountains owes something to the moon's gentle gravity. With only about 1/6 of Earth's pull holding everything down, a block of crust can stand taller and with steeper sides than it could on a heavier world, where its own weight would slump and spread it. So Io can lift sharp, abrupt peaks, far higher than the greatest mountains on Earth. Great tilted slabs rising in clean, severe lines from the plains around them, holding shapes that a stronger gravity would not allow to stand. Most of these mountains stand alone, rather than in long chains, isolated blocks scattered across the surface, wherever the crust has buckled and heaved upward. This sets them apart from the mountain ranges of Earth, which often run in great connected lines where the planet's plates press together. Io's peaks are more solitary, each one a separate response to the local squeeze of the crust, rising on its own, throwing its own long shadow, and in time shedding its own slow avalanches across the surrounding ground as it begins. Like everything on Io, to come apart again. And like everything on Io, the mountains are part of a slow cycle rather than a fixed feature. New blocks are thrust up as the burial continues. Old mountains collapse and spread across the plains, their debris buried in turn by fresh flows and frost. The peaks come and go on a timescale far longer than the quick comings and goings of the plumes, but they come and go all the same. Even the highest, steepest, most solid-looking places on Io are only passing through, raised and worn down again on the endless wheel of a world that cannot hold still. Part 9. The air that freezes and falls. Io has an atmosphere, though only barely, and it is unlike the air of any other world. It is made chiefly of sulfur dioxide, the very gas that pours from its volcanoes. And it is extraordinarily thin, a faint whisper of gas held close against the surface. It is far too tenuous to breathe, far too thin to feel as any kind of wind, far too slight to carry sound. To call it an atmosphere at all stretches the word, and yet it is real, and it does something no other atmosphere does. This thin envelope has two sources, and the balance between them gives Io's air its peculiar character. Some of the atmosphere comes directly from the volcanoes, which vent sulfur dioxide gas straight into the sky as they erupt. The rest comes from frost. Across the cold surface, sulfur dioxide that has frozen into pale frost slowly turns back into gas wherever the faint sunlight warms it. So Io's air is fed from below by eruption, and from the ground itself by the warming of frost, a delicate balance of venting and sublimating that keeps a patchy haze around the moon. The strangest thing about Io's atmosphere, the thing that sets it apart from every other, is that it collapses. Sulfur dioxide freezes readily at the temperatures Io endures, and so when the surface cools, the atmosphere does not simply thin. It freezes out of the sky altogether, settling onto the ground as frost. Io's air is forever poised, right at the edge between gas and frost, ready to fall out of the sky the moment the warmth that holds it aloft is taken away. That moment comes regularly. On the night side of Io, where the faint sun has set, the surface grows colder and much of the atmosphere freezes down onto the ground. And the effect is even more complete when Io passes into Jupiter's shadow. Because Io orbits so close to the giant planet, it regularly slips behind Jupiter and into its enormous shadow, cut off entirely from the distant sun's light. In that full eclipse, the surface cools sharply, and a great part of the atmosphere simply freezes and falls, settling onto the ground as a fresh coating of frost. Then the light returns, and the process reverses. As Io emerges from Jupiter's shadow, or as the long Ionian day brings sunlight back to the frozen ground, the frost warms and turns once more to gas, and the atmosphere rises again into the sky. The air lifts back up from the surface that swallowed it, restoring the thin envelope until the next darkness brings it down once more. Io breathes on the rhythm of light and shadow, its atmosphere condensing into the ground in the dark and rising back into the sky with the returning light. It is a gentle image when you hold it, a world that exhales its thin air into the sky in the light and draws it back down into the ground in the dark, over and over, on the slow rhythm of its passage around the giant. There is no drama to it, no violence in this particular process, only a quiet cycling of gas and frost as the warmth comes and goes. Among all of Io's restless activity, the breathing of its atmosphere is one of the softer motions, a slow rising and settling that follows the simple coming and going of the light. The thinness of this air is also why Io's plumes behave as they do, rising in those clean, graceful arcs we considered earlier. With so little atmosphere to push against, the erupted material climbs almost as if into open space, unhindered by any thick blanket of air. The same thinness is why the surface temperatures swing so sharply between the warm vents and the cold plains, for there is no substantial atmosphere to spread the heat around and even it out. Io's strange, collapsing air shapes much of what makes the rest of the moon so extreme. The atmosphere also marks the boundary where Io meets the larger world of Jupiter's surroundings, because it is from the top of this thin envelope that material escapes into space. The uppermost reaches of the atmosphere are stripped away by the fierce environment around Jupiter, carrying Io's sulfur and oxygen outward into the space beyond. So the air is not only rising and falling between sky and ground, it is also slowly leaking away at the top, feeding the great structures around Jupiter that we will turn to next. For all its thinness, then, Io's atmosphere is a busy and important thing. It is fed by fire from below and frost from the ground. It freezes and falls in shadow and rises again in light. It shapes the arcs of the plumes and the extremes of the surface temperature. And it bleeds slowly away into space, connecting Io to the giant it circles. A whisper of gas, barely there, and yet woven into nearly everything the moon does. Io's thin atmosphere is not spread evenly across the moon. It gathers most thickly over the active volcanic regions, where fresh gas is constantly venting, and across the warmer ground near the equator, where the frozen sulfur dioxide most readily turns back to gas in the faint sunlight. Toward the colder poles and across the night side, the air thins drastically, much of it frozen down onto the ground. So the atmosphere is patchy and uneven, denser in some places and nearly absent in others, shifting with the activity of the volcanoes and the slow passage of light across the surface. The collapse of the atmosphere during an eclipse is a real and measurable thing, not merely a figure of speech. As Io slips into Jupiter's shadow and the faint sunlight is cut off, a large share of the atmosphere freezes onto the surface within a short time, and the thin envelope around the moon noticeably thins. When the moon emerges again into the light, the frost warms, and the gas rises once more, and the atmosphere rebuilds itself. This rapid freezing and lifting, tied so directly to the coming and going of the light, is unlike the steady air of any other world, and it marks Io as strange, even in the way it holds its breath. Picture it one more time before we move outward. A faint haze of sulfur dioxide clinging to a cold and colorful world, brightening as the light returns, fading and falling as the shadow comes. The most violent world in the solar system wears the thinnest and most fragile of atmospheres, an envelope so delicate it freezes onto the ground each time the light is taken away. Fire below, and above it, an air that can barely hold itself up, breathing slowly in and out with the turning of the moon around its giant. Part 10. The Ring of Light around the giant. Io does not keep its fire to itself. The volcanoes that resurface the moon also leak material into the space around it, and that leaking has built one of the largest and most remarkable structures in the entire solar system. To understand it, we have to step back from the surface of Io and look at the moon within its setting, circling the giant planet, trailing a slow loss of material behind it as it goes. Every second, roughly a ton of material escapes from the top of Io's thin atmosphere into space. This is sulfur and oxygen, the products of all that volcanic activity, stripped away from the moon by the fierce environment around Jupiter. A ton each second may sound like a great loss, and over time it adds up. But Io is a world the size of our moon, and this slow bleeding is a small thing against its total mass. Still, that steady stream of escaping gas has somewhere to go, and what it builds is extraordinary. The material that escapes from Io spreads out along the path of its orbit, forming a great ring that encircles Jupiter, threaded through by Io's own track around the planet. This ring is shaped like an enormous donut, a circular tube of gas wrapped all the way around the giant at the distance of Io's orbit. It is constantly replenished by the moon's eruptions, fed grain by grain, second by second, by the fire on the surface below. Io is forever pouring a little of itself into this ring, and the ring is forever glowing with what Io gives it. The gas in this ring does not stay as ordinary gas for long. In the harsh environment around Jupiter, the atoms are stripped of some of their electrons, turned into charged particles, into what is called a plasma. And so the ring becomes a glowing band of charged gas, energized by Jupiter's surroundings, shining in wavelengths that instruments can see clearly even when the eye cannot. It is a planet-sized halo of light, hanging in space around the giant, built entirely from the material of one small, burning moon. There is a quiet grandeur in this. A single moon, the size of ours, has wrapped its parent planet in a ring of its own substance, a glowing circle of gas spanning the immense distance of its orbit. Everything in that ring was once part of Io, lifted from the surface by a volcano, carried up through the thin atmosphere, and stripped away into space, there to join the slow circling halo around the giant. The ring is, in a sense, Io spread thin across the sky, the moon's fire turned into a band of light around the world it orbits. This ring of plasma is also a crucial part of how Io interacts with Jupiter's wider environment, because it lies embedded within the giant planet's enormous magnetic field. Jupiter possesses by far the strongest magnetic field of any planet around the Sun, a field so large that, if it could be seen from Earth, it would appear bigger than the full moon in our sky. Io orbits far within this field, and the ring of charged gas it feeds becomes a participant in the great electrical machinery that surrounds the planet. The material in the ring is gradually swept up and carried along by Jupiter's rotating magnetic field, drawn outward and spread through the space around the planet. In this way, Io's lost substance does not simply sit in its ring. It is fed into the larger system, becoming part of the great envelope of charged particles that fills the space around Jupiter, the source of much of the material that populates the giant's surroundings. A surprising share of everything circling Jupiter, in the form of this thin charged gas, traces its origin back to the volcanoes of Io. So the fire on Io's surface has effects that reach far beyond the moon itself. It paves the surface and builds the mountains and feeds the thin atmosphere, yes. But it also reaches out across hundreds of thousands of kilometers, building a glowing ring around an entire giant planet and feeding the great electrical environment that surrounds it. The most volcanic world in the solar system is also, in its quiet way, one of the most influential, shaping the space around the largest planet through the slow, steady gift of its own eruptions. It is a strange and lovely thought that a moon can paint a ring around its planet out of its own substance. We tend to think of moons as small, passive things, circling their planets and reflecting a little light. Io is nothing of the kind. It is an active participant in the life of the Jupiter system, constantly remaking not only itself, but the space around it, drawing a luminous circle around the giant with the material of its own fire. The ring would be there, whether or not anyone watched, glowing softly, endlessly refilled. The ring of plasma that Io feeds is enormous, far larger than the moon that supplies it, a band of glowing charged gas wrapped entirely around the giant planet at the distance of Io's orbit. It shines in wavelengths that instruments can read clearly, a softly luminous circle hanging in the space around Jupiter, and it has been studied closely as one of the clearest windows onto how the Moon and the planet exchange material. Everything in that ring was lifted from Io's surface, atom by atom, by the volcanoes below, and carried up and out into the space around the giant. Once the material reaches the ring, it does not stay still. Jupiter's swift rotation drags its great magnetic field around with it, and that turning field sweeps up the charged gas and flings it gradually outward, spreading Io's lost substance through the wider space around the planet. In this way, a surprising share of all the thin material that fills Jupiter's surroundings can be traced back to the eruptions of this one small moon. Io does not merely orbit the giant. It quietly supplies the very stuff of the space the giant moves through, feeding its surroundings grain by grain across the ages. And all of it begins with the same engine we started with, the slow flexing of Io by Jupiter's gravity and the rhythm of the three moons. That flexing melts the rock. The molten rock erupts. The eruptions feed the thin air. The air leaks away into space, and the lost material spreads into a glowing ring around the planet. Pull on any thread of Io's story, and you find the same patient force at the other end of it, the gentle, relentless squeeze that keeps a small moon burning, and in the burning, lighting a ring around a giant. Part 11. A thread of electricity. The bond between Io and Jupiter is not only a matter of gas and gravity. It is also, remarkably, electrical. As Io moves through Jupiter's immense magnetic field, it behaves like a conductor sweeping through a magnet, and that motion generates a colossal flow of electric current through the space between the Moon and the planet. Io is wired to Jupiter by an invisible thread of electricity, and the scale of that connection is hard to take in. When any electrical conductor moves through a magnetic field, it generates a voltage, a push that can drive a current. This is the same basic principle that runs the generators which light our homes, only here it operates on the scale of a moon and a giant planet. Io, moving steadily through Jupiter's powerful field, becomes such a generator. A great electrical potential builds between the moon and the planet, and a current flows along the magnetic field lines that connect them, bridging the space between Io and Jupiter's poles. The numbers are immense. The current flowing along this connection reaches millions of amperes, an electrical flow far beyond anything in our everyday experience, carried through the near vacuum of space along the invisible lines of Jupiter's field. This tube of current links Io to the polar regions of the giant planet, a steady electrical bridge stretched across hundreds of thousands of kilometers, sustained by the simple fact of the moon's motion through the field. It is one of the most powerful, steady electrical connections known anywhere in the solar system. Where this current reaches Jupiter, it leaves a visible mark, and this is perhaps the most beautiful part of the whole arrangement. Jupiter, like the Earth, has auroras, great glowing displays of light in its upper atmosphere near its poles, where charged particles strike the gas and make it shine. But Jupiter's auroras carry a feature ours do not. Within the planet's polar glow, there is a bright, steady spot that marks the exact place where Io's electrical connection meets the atmosphere. Io paints its own glowing footprint onto the giant planet. This footprint moves as Io moves, tracing the moon's position in the giant's aurora. As Io travels along its orbit, the bright spot it creates travels too, sweeping through Jupiter's polar light in step with the moon far away. It is as though Io signs its name continuously upon the planet, a glowing point of light that follows the moon's path, written into the aurora by the current that flows between them. Among all the moons of Jupiter, this connection is one of the clearest signs of just how deeply Io and the giant are bound together. Beyond the current and the footprint, Io is also wrapped in faint clouds of neutral atoms that stretch far out into the space around it. There is, in particular, a cloud of sodium atoms surrounding the moon, glowing softly and reaching out to great distances, sometimes trailing away into long streamers that extend far from Io itself. These tenuous clouds are yet another sign of the moon quietly shedding its material into space, the escaping atoms spreading out to tint the region around it with their faint, soft light. All of these phenomena, the current, the footprint, the glowing clouds, are different expressions of the same underlying fact. Io is not isolated in space. It is electrically and materially joined to Jupiter, woven into the giant's magnetic environment so thoroughly that the two cannot really be considered apart. The moon feeds the planet's surroundings with gas, lights a spot in its aurora with current, and surrounds itself with soft clouds of its own escaping substance. It is a connection of extraordinary intimacy, carried on silently across the empty distance between them. There is something quietly moving in the idea of a moon and a planet joined by a thread of electricity across the void. We picture space as empty, and in a sense it is, almost entirely so. And yet through that emptiness runs this steady current, this invisible bridge of energy linking Io to Jupiter's poles, never failing, sustained simply by the moon's faithful motion along its orbit. The two worlds speak to each other constantly in the language of electricity and light, across a gap that looks, to the eye, like nothing at all. And once again, the root of all of it is the same patient engine. Io moves through Jupiter's field because it orbits the giant, held on its slightly stretched path by the rhythm of the three moons. The motion through the field generates the current. The current lights the footprint. The volcanoes, fed by the same orbital flexing, supply the gas and the glowing clouds. Every visible sign of the bond between Io and Jupiter traces back to the gravity and the geometry we began with, the quiet arithmetic that keeps the whole system turning. The bright footprint that Io paints in Jupiter's aurora is not a single point alone. Trailing behind it runs a fainter glowing tail, a wake left in the aurora where the disturbance Io creates is slowly carried along and fades. This tail stretches away from the main spot, like the wake behind a boat, a soft, luminous trace marking the path the connection has swept through the planet's polar light. It is one more sign of how actively Io stirs the space around the giant, leaving not just a mark, but a lingering trail wherever its current touches down. The other large moons leave their own fainter marks in Jupiter's aurora as well, each one trailing its own small footprint where its connection meets the planet. But Io's is by far the brightest and the most studied, because Io is the most active of them, the one most thoroughly woven into the giant's field through its volcanism and its closeness. Among the family of moons that circle Jupiter, Io is the one that writes its name most boldly upon the planet, a steady, bright point in the aurora that follows the burning moon faithfully around its orbit. So the thread holds, across the dark, between the burning moon and the banded giant. A current of millions of amperes, a footprint of light in the aurora, a soft cloud of sodium trailing into space. None of it loud, none of it sudden, all of it steady and continuous, the slow electrical conversation of two worlds that have been bound together far longer than there have been any eyes to notice. Io burns and turns and writes its glowing name upon the giant, over and over, in silence. Part 12. The storm overhead. There is one more force shaping Io that comes not from within the moon, but from the space around it, and it is among the harshest environments, anywhere near the sun. Io orbits far inside Jupiter's radiation belts, a region where charged particles are trapped by the giant's magnetic field and accelerated to enormous energies. The moon is bathed, constantly, and from every side, in a storm of high-energy radiation, and it sits squarely in one of the most punishing zones of that storm. Jupiter's magnetic field, the same field that draws material from Io and carries the great electrical current, also traps charged particles and holds them in great belts around the planet. Within these belts, the particles are whipped to tremendous speeds, forming a region of intense radiation that surrounds the giant. The belts are strongest closer to the planet, and Io, orbiting where it does, lies within a fierce and active part of them. The radiation near Io is among the most severe in the solar system. This radiation would be quickly fatal to an unshielded human, and it is punishing even to the hardened machines we build to explore. Any spacecraft venturing close to Io must contend with a flood of high-energy particles capable of damaging its electronics and degrading its instruments. This is one of the central reasons no craft has ever landed on Io, and why the moon is studied from passing flybys rather than from a settled, long-term presence close to its surface. The radiation alone makes Io one of the most hostile destinations imaginable. On the surface itself, this constant bombardment is yet another agent of change, adding to everything the volcanoes already do. The high-energy particles hitting the ground alter the chemistry of the sulfur compounds that coat the moon, helping to alter and transform them, playing a quiet role in the shifting colors of the surface. Io is not only burning from within and breathing its thin air in and out, it is also being steadily worked upon from above, its surface chemistry reshaped by the ceaseless rain of radiation pouring down from the belts around Jupiter. It is worth pausing to gather just how many forces are at work on this one small moon at once. There is the tidal flexing from within, melting the rock and feeding the volcanoes. There is the constant resurfacing, paving the ground and building the mountains. There is the thin atmosphere, freezing and rising with the light. There is the loss of material into the ring of plasma and the electrical current bridging the gap to Jupiter, and now this storm of radiation overhead. Io sits at the meeting point of all of them, a world worked upon from every direction at once. And yet, for all the harshness of the radiation, it too is part of a stable, enduring system, rather than a sudden catastrophe. The belts have surrounded Jupiter for an immense span of time, and Io has orbited within them just as long, enduring the radiation the way it endures, the flexing and the burning, as a permanent condition of its existence, rather than a passing crisis. The storm overhead is fierce, but it is also constant and old, a fixed feature of the world Io inhabits, no more an emergency than the heat below or the cold of the distant sun. From a human point of view, the radiation environment around Io is forbidding, a barrier that keeps us at a distance and makes close study difficult and dangerous for our machines. But from the moon's own perspective, if such a thing can be imagined, it is simply the sky it lives under, the same sky it has always known. Io does not suffer the radiation the way we would. It merely exists within it, its surface slowly reshaped by it, one more force among the many that keep the moon in its ceaseless state of change. The radiation also reminds us how completely Io belongs to Jupiter, how thoroughly the moon's nature is set by the giant it circles. The flexing that drives the volcanoes comes from Jupiter's gravity. The ring of plasma and the electrical current come from Jupiter's magnetic field. And the storm of radiation comes from that same field, trapping and accelerating particles around the planet. Io is, in nearly every respect, a creation of its relationship with Jupiter, shaped inside and out by the presence of the largest world the Sun ever made. Picture Io, then, within its harsh setting, and you begin to see the full strangeness of its situation. A small rocky moon, burning from within, breathing its frozen breath in and out, painting itself in sulfur, bleeding into a glowing ring, wired to its planet by a current of light, and all the while bathed in a storm of radiation pouring down from the belts above. It is one of the most extreme places in the solar system, not for any single reason, but because so many extremes meet upon it at once. To put the harshness in perspective, the radiation near Io is among the most severe sustained environments anywhere around the Sun, far beyond what living things or delicate machines can easily endure. The charged particles trapped in Jupiter's belts are accelerated to such energies that they pass through ordinary shielding and damage the sensitive electronics within. Spacecraft that venture close must be built with special hardening and must limit how long they linger, gathering what they can in brief passes before retreating to gentler distances. The Moon sits in a place we can visit only carefully and briefly, never comfortably. On the surface, this constant bombardment slowly reworks the chemistry of the ground, adding its own quiet hand to the Moon's endless changes. The high-energy particles alter the sulfur compounds they strike, helping to shift their colors and forms over time, working alongside the heat of the volcanoes and the cold of the distant Sun. So Io is shaped from three directions at once, by the fire rising from within, by the cold pressing from the great distance, and by the rain of particles falling from the belts above, all of them together keeping the surface in its restless, ever-shifting state. Holding all of that together is a lot to ask of the mind, and there is no need to grasp it all firmly. It is enough to let the picture form gently, the way one might watch a far-off storm without being touched by it. Io endures its many forces quietly, far away, beneath the giant. The radiation falls, the volcanoes burn, the air freezes and rises, and the Moon goes on turning, held in the grip of forces it does not feel as we would, simply being what the geometry of its orbit has made it. Part 13. Beneath the crust. Having walked across the surface of Io and out into the space around it, we can turn now to what lies beneath, to the structure hidden under the colored crust. Like the rocky planets, Io is layered, separated long ago into distinct regions by its own warmth. At the center sits a core, around the core a mantle of hot rock, and over the mantle a relatively thin and brittle crust, the surface layer that the volcanoes break through to erupt. Io's core is made of iron, and iron mixed with sulfur, and it takes up a substantial fraction of the Moon's radius, a dense metallic center to a dense metallic world. This large iron core is part of why Io is the densest moon known. Around it lies the mantle, a thick region of rock kept hot by the tidal flexing, much of it close to the temperature at which rock begins to melt. And above the mantle is the crust, thin by comparison, the cooled outer shell that holds in the heat below and that the rising magma must cross to reach the surface. There are strong signs that within the mantle, beneath the crust, lies a layer of at least partly molten rock. This would be a region of soft, melting material spread through much of the Moon, perhaps something close to a buried ocean of magma, a global layer of melt held in the rock beneath the surface. Such a layer would help explain one of Io's quietest puzzles, which is how so many volcanoes, spread across the entire Moon, can all be fed at once. Rather than drawing on isolated pockets of melt, the volcanoes may draw on a shared, world-spanning reservoir, kept hot by the flexing of the whole body. Exactly how molten this layer is, and exactly how far down it lies, remains an open question that those who study Io are still working to answer. It may be a true ocean of liquid rock, or it may be more like a soft, partly melted sponge of mantle, mostly solid, but shot through with melt. The evidence points clearly to something molten down there, but the precise nature of it is still being pieced together. It is one of several things about Io's interior that we can sense the shape of without yet seeing in full detail. What the layered structure makes clear, though, is that Io is melted from the inside out by the tidal engine. The flexing does not warm only a narrow zone. It heats the mantle broadly, keeping a great volume of rock near or past the point of melting, and that warmed, softened, partly molten interior is the reservoir from which all the surface activity is drawn. The volcanoes, the lakes, the flows, the plumes, all of them are surface expressions of a moon that is hot and soft within, kept that way by the endless squeeze from Jupiter. There is a quiet irony buried in Io's interior, and it concerns water. Io is bone dry, holding essentially none of the water that fills so many of the outer moons. Its neighbors farther from Jupiter are layered with ice, and at least one of them is thought to hide a great ocean of liquid water beneath its frozen shell. Io, closest of the large moons to the giant, has almost no water at all. And the likeliest reason for this dryness is the very heat that makes it so violent. Over the long ages, the relentless tidal heating that drives Io's volcanoes also baked away whatever water the moon may once have held. Water is volatile, easily driven off by heat, and a world warmed as thoroughly and as long as Io has been warmed could not hold on to it. The water was heated, turned to vapor, driven up and out of the moon and lost to space, leaving behind only the rock, the metal, and the sulfur that remain. The same engine that gives Io its fire is the engine that took away its water. This is a sharp contrast to set gently beside the moon's neighbors. The icy moons farther out, warmed only mildly by their own weaker tidal flexing, kept their water and may cradle hidden seas beneath their ice, quiet and dark and possibly stable for ages. Io, warmed far more fiercely, kept none of its water and instead became a world of open fire. The same broad process, tidal heating, gives one moon a buried ocean and burns another one dry, depending only on how strong the flexing happens to be. So beneath Io's restless, colorful surface lies a structure that explains the restlessness. A dense iron core, a broad mantle kept hot and partly molten by the flexing, a thin crust pierced everywhere by rising magma, and almost no water anywhere, long since driven off by the heat. It is the interior of a world built and maintained by a single force, melted from within, dried from within, kept forever active by the patient pull of the giant it circles. The clearest sign of Io's molten interior comes from the way the moon responds to Jupiter's magnetic field as it orbits through it. A layer of melted rock, being a far better conductor of electricity than solid stone, reacts to the changing field around it in a way that can be detected from afar, and Io's response points to just such a conducting layer beneath its crust. It is an indirect kind of seeing, reading the inside of a world by how it answers the field it moves through, and it tells us that something broadly molten lies down there, spread through the moon beneath the surface. The dryness this heat produced is one of the quiet ironies of the whole Jupiter system. The moons are arranged, more or less, by how much water they hold, and the arrangement runs opposite to the fire. Io, closest to the giant and most fiercely flexed, was baked dry and became a world of open lava. Its neighbors farther out, flexed more gently, kept their water and may cradle hidden seas beneath their ice. The same force, tidal heating, gives one moon a buried ocean and burns another to bare rock, and the only difference between those fates is how close the moon sits to the giant and how hard it is squeezed. And when you hold the inside and the outside of Io together, the whole moon resolves into a kind of unity. The hot, soft interior feeds the surface fire. The surface fire feeds the thin air. The thin air feeds the ring of plasma and the glowing clouds. The motion through Jupiter's field lights the electrical footprint. And all of it, surface and interior alike, rests on the steady flexing that keeps the rock melted and the world awake. Io is not a collection of separate marvels. It is one marvel, seen from many sides, a single engine expressing itself in fire and color and light. Part 14. How we came to know it. For most of human history, Io was nothing more than a point of light. It was one of 4 bright specks first seen beside Jupiter when the telescope was a new invention. 4 little stars that moved from night to night, circling the giant planet. The discovery that those specks orbited Jupiter, rather than the Earth, was itself a quiet turning point in how people understood their place among the worlds. But Io remained, for 4 centuries, little more than a moving dot, too far away to show any detail at all. Through all that time, no one could have guessed what Io truly was. Seen only as a point of light, it gave no hint of its volcanoes, its molten lakes, its towering plumes, its painted surface. It was simply assumed, reasonably enough, to be another cratered, quiet world like our own moon, a dead ball of rock circling the giant. The idea that this distant speck might be the most volcanically active world in the solar system would have seemed unlikely in the extreme, with nothing in view to suggest it. Everything changed when the first spacecraft flew close enough to see Io clearly. In the images sent back across the great distance, a careful eye studying the pictures noticed something standing off the edge of the moon, a faint, glowing dome rising above the curve of the surface. It was a plume, an enormous fountain of erupted material, caught in the very act of rising into space. It was the first time anyone had ever seen an active volcano anywhere beyond the Earth, and it transformed Io in an instant. That single observation rewrote what Io was understood to be. In the space of one discovery, the moon went from a presumed dead rock to the most volcanically alive world we know. All at once, the strange colors made sense, and the absence of craters, and the unusual surface. Io was not quiet at all. It was erupting, constantly, and had likely been erupting all along. Through all the centuries, it had been watched as a mere point of light. The fire had always been there. We had simply never been close enough to see it. In the years that followed, a spacecraft was sent to circle Jupiter and study its moons over a long span of time, and it gave us our richest understanding of Io. Orbiting the giant for years, it passed Io again and again, mapping its volcanoes, watching its plumes rise and fall, measuring the heat pouring from its surface, and tracing the slow changes as one region brightened and another dimmed. Much of what we know about Io's volcanism, its lakes and flows and shifting hotspots, comes from that patient, long-term watching from orbit. Other visits added their own chapters. A spacecraft passing through the Jupiter system on its way to the outer reaches of the solar system caught a giant eruption in progress, imaging an enormous plume standing tall above one of Io's polar regions, a rare direct look at a major eruption as it happened. And more recently, a spacecraft in orbit around Jupiter has made close passes over Io, returning the sharpest views yet of its burning surface, refining and deepening the picture built by all the visits before it. Through all of this, one thing has remained constant. No spacecraft has ever landed on Io, and none has stayed close to it for long. The radiation environment around the moon is so fierce that lingering near it is punishing even for hardened machines, and a soft landing on that restless, repaving surface would be a daunting prospect for many reasons. So Io continues to be studied, as it always has been, from a respectful distance, watched and measured and imaged from passing craft rather than touched. It remains, in a sense, a world held just beyond our reach. There is a fitting humility in that. The most violent world in the solar system is also one we can only observe from afar, never quite drawing close, never setting anything down upon its burning ground. We have learned a great deal about Io, enough to fill a long night's telling, and yet we have done it all at arm's length, reading the moon from a careful distance, piecing together its nature from light and heat and the faint signals it sends across the dark. Io keeps its surface to itself, and we watch, and that watching has been enough to reveal a wonder. It is worth remembering, too, how recent all of this knowledge is. For the overwhelming majority of the time people have known Io existed, they knew it only as a moving point of light, with no inkling of the fire it held. The whole full picture we have been building tonight, the volcanoes and lakes and plumes and rings and currents, belongs almost entirely to the brief span since the first close flyby. We are among the first generations of people who have known Io for what it truly is, rather than for the quiet dot it had always appeared to be. There is a quiet footnote in the history of these moons that is worth telling. Long before anyone knew Io held a single volcano, the careful timing of the 4 moons slipping in and out of Jupiter's shadow gave people one of their first real measures of the speed of light. The moons seem to fall behind and then catch up to their predicted schedule depending on how far the Earth happened to be from Jupiter, and the only sensible explanation was that light itself took time to cross the changing distance between the worlds. So Io helped reveal a fact about light itself centuries before it revealed its fire. Interest in Io has only grown as our picture of it has sharpened, and there is a steady desire to send craft back for closer looks. The challenge is always the same, the fierce radiation that makes any close, lingering study so punishing for our machines. And so the plans that are imagined tend to favor quick passes and clever shielding, rather than any settled presence near the surface. Io remains a world we approach with caution and study from a careful distance, and it is likely to stay that way, watched closely but never quite touched, for a long while yet. And so the moon that was a speck became a world, and the world revealed a fire no one had imagined. From 4 little stars beside Jupiter to the most volcanically active body we know, the story of how we came to understand Io is a small and gentle reminder that the universe keeps its surprises close and gives them up slowly, only to those patient enough to keep looking. Io was always burning. It simply waited, as it still waits, for us to come close enough to see. Part 15. The doors left open. For all that we have learned about Io, the moon keeps its share of secrets, and they are the kind that invite quiet wonder rather than any unease. The questions that remain are not troubling gaps but open doors, the ordinary and comfortable not knowing that surrounds any world still being studied. It is worth spending a little time among these open questions, because they are part of what makes Io endlessly interesting to those who watch it. The first open question concerns the interior we considered earlier. We can tell that something molten lies beneath Io's crust, a layer of melt spread through the mantle. But whether this is truly a global ocean of liquid rock, or instead a soft, partly melted layer that is mostly solid, is still being worked out. The answer shapes how we picture the whole inside of the moon, and it is not yet settled. Io holds its interior close, revealing the shape of it without quite showing the detail. A second question is stranger and, in its way, more intriguing. Models of how the tidal flexing should heat Io make predictions about where the heat ought to concentrate, and therefore where the volcanoes ought to cluster. But when the actual volcanoes are mapped, the most active regions sit noticeably offset from where the simplest models predict they should be. The fire is not quite where the theory says it should be. Something about how heat moves through Io's interior, how it flows and rises and finds its way to the surface, is not yet fully understood. This offset is a genuine puzzle, and a quietly delightful one. It means that even with the basic engine well understood, the patient flexing that melts the rock, there is still some subtlety in the way that heat travels upward that escapes our current picture. Perhaps the interior moves and mixes in ways that carry the heat sideways before it reaches the surface. Perhaps the structure of the mantle steers the melt. The moon erupts where it erupts, and the precise reason it favors those places over others remains, for now, an open thread. A third question concerns time and history. Io has clearly been volcanically active for a very long stretch, but the full story of its heating is not settled. The flexing depends on the resonance among Io, Europa, and Ganymede, and that orbital arrangement may itself have shifted slowly over the ages. So Io's activity may not have been perfectly steady. It may have surged and eased over immense spans of time as the resonance strengthened and relaxed, the moon burning more fiercely in some eras and more gently in others. The rhythm of that long history is still being traced. There are smaller mysteries too, woven through the details. The exact plumbing that connects the molten interior to each particular vent is only partly mapped. Why some plumes wander while others hold their place is understood in outline but not in full. The precise chemistry of the surface colors, the way sulfur and its compounds shift and settle and are reworked by heat and radiation, holds its own subtleties. Each of these is a small open door, a place where Io still keeps something back from those who study it. It would be a mistake to find anything ominous in these unanswered questions. They are not signs of danger or disorder. They are simply the natural condition of a world that is real and complex and far away, studied carefully but not exhaustively, known well but not completely. Every world worth knowing keeps some of itself in reserve, and Io is no exception. The open questions are an invitation, a reason to keep watching, rather than a cause for any worry. In truth, there is something restful in the idea that Io is not fully solved. A world entirely known would have nothing left to offer the imagination. A world with doors still open, with mysteries still gently unresolved, remains alive to the mind, a place that can still surprise. The puzzles of Io, the uncertain interior, the misplaced volcanoes, the unsettled history, keep the moon interesting, keep it worth returning to, keep it from being merely a list of finished facts. And these are the comfortable kind of unknowns, the kind one can rest beside without strain. There is no need to resolve them tonight, no need to hold them tightly or worry them over. They are simply there, out at Jupiter, quietly waiting the way they have waited all along. Those who study Io will keep working at them patiently across the years to come. The rest of us can simply let them be, a few soft questions hanging in the dark around a burning moon. The puzzle of the misplaced volcanoes is one of the more quietly fascinating things about Io, precisely because the basic engine is so well understood. We know the flexing heats the moon, and the simplest pictures of that flexing predict where the warmth, and therefore the eruptions, ought to gather. Yet the most active regions sit shifted away from those predicted places by a noticeable amount. The heat is being made where we expect, but it seems to surface somewhere else, as though it travels sideways through the interior before it finds its way out, carried by motions in the mantle that we have not yet fully traced. The question of whether Io holds a true global ocean of magma, or only a soft and partly melted layer, sits at the center of much that we still wonder about the moon. The two pictures are different in important ways. One, a connected world-spanning sea of melt. The other, a mostly solid mantle, merely shot through with pockets of liquid. The evidence leans towards something broadly molten, but the precise nature of it stays just out of reach, a shape sensed through indirect signs rather than seen outright. It is the kind of question that keeps a world interesting and that keeps those who study it returning patiently for another look. So we leave the open doors open, as they should be. Io goes on erupting whether or not we understand exactly where or why. The interior stays soft and partly hidden. The volcanoes burn a little to one side of where the theory expects them. The long history of the flexing runs on, mostly unread. And the moon turns beneath its giant, keeping its small secrets close, content, as it has always been, to reveal itself slowly to anyone patient enough to keep looking. Part 16. The Quiet Behind the Fire. We have come a long way around this small and burning world, and it is time to gather what we have seen and let it settle. By any fair measure, Io is the most violent world in the solar system. It holds more volcanoes than any other body, more active eruptions, more raw heat pouring from its surface. It carries lakes of molten rock, fountains that climb hundreds of kilometers into space, mountains shoved up by the weight of endless burial, a thin air that freezes and falls, a ring of glowing gas drawn around its giant, and a storm of radiation overhead. By the standards of a calm and quiet world, Io is relentless. And yet the most remarkable thing about Io is not the violence itself. It is where the violence comes from. All of that fire, all of that ceaseless activity, traces back to something almost gentle, the steady, patient pull of gravity and the quiet arithmetic of 3 moons keeping time with one another around a giant planet. There is no anger in it, no malice, no sudden catastrophe waiting to be triggered. There is only physics, repeating, as regular as a heartbeat and as predictable as an orbit. The same flex that cracks Io's crust and feeds its fire is as steady and unhurried as the moon's slow circling of Jupiter. It does not lash out. It does not build toward any climax. It simply rises and falls, orbit after orbit, melting the rock and lifting the plumes and painting the surface, in the same patient rhythm it has kept for an immense span of time. Io is not raging against anything. It is only answering, over and over, the gentle tug of the world it circles, the way it always has and always will. Seen in that light, the most violent place in the solar system becomes, strangely, one of the most peaceful to contemplate. The fire is not chaos. It is order, expressed as fire. The 400 volcanoes are not a disaster. They are the calm, inevitable result of a small world being warmed more than it can hold, letting that warmth go in the only ways it can. There is a quiet steadiness underneath all the apparent fury, the quiet constancy of a system that has been doing exactly this, in exactly this way, since long before anyone was here to call it violent. Io will keep doing it too, whether or not anyone watches. It will go on erupting through its hundreds of vents, turning over its molten lakes, lifting its silent fountains into the dark, and letting them fall back as colored rings. It will keep breathing its thin air down into the frost and back up into the sky. It will keep bleeding its substance into the glowing ring around the giant and writing its bright footprint in the aurora. None of it requires an audience. None of it asks anything of us at all. And there is a kind of comfort in that indifference when you let yourself feel it gently. Io is utterly unbothered by us, utterly absorbed in the slow work of being what it is. It does not need to be understood to keep burning. It does not need to be watched to keep turning. It simply continues, far away, beneath its giant, in the faint light of the distant sun, doing what the geometry of its orbit has made it do, as faithfully as the orbit itself. The violence is real, and it is also, in its own way, profoundly calm. So let the picture of it rest in your mind now, softening as it goes. A moon the size of our own, wrapped in quiet fire. A surface that paints and erases itself in sulfur and shadow. Fountains rising in silence and falling in graceful arcs. Lakes of molten rock turning their crusts over slowly in the dark. A ring of soft light drawn around a banded giant, and a thread of current bridging the space between them. All of it steady, all of it patient, all of it held together by the gentlest of forces, repeating without end. There is nothing in any of it that you need to carry. The fire on Io is not a threat to anyone, only a far-off marvel, burning safely across an immense distance, asking nothing and demanding nothing. It has burned through ages without number, and will burn through ages more, long after this night has been forgotten, keeping its patient rhythm beneath the giant. You can simply let it be, a distant warmth in the dark, turning slowly while you grow still. When you set all of Io's traits side by side, the unity of the moon becomes its quiet lesson. The closeness to the giant, the rhythm shared with the two outer moons, the flexing, the melted interior, the 400 volcanoes, the molten lakes, the silent fountains, the painted ground, the pushed-up mountains, the breathing air, the glowing ring, the thread of current, the dryness, even the storm of radiation overhead. None of these is a separate marvel. Each one follows from the others, and all of them follow from a single patient force, traced from one end of the moon to the other. That is perhaps the gentlest thing to carry away from a night spent with Io. Behind what looks at first like pure violence lies a single, steady, comprehensible cause, repeating without haste and without end. The most extreme world we know turns out to be one of the most orderly, its every feature flowing from the same quiet pull. There is no chaos to fear in it, only a quiet and patient regularity, the same few facts expressing themselves over and over in fire and color and light, far away, beneath the slow-turning bands of the giant. And so we leave Io where it has always been, burning quietly in the shadow of its giant, repainting its face in the dark, asking nothing of anyone who watches. The fire is not anger. It is only the slow pull of gravity, repeating, as steady as breath. Let that steadiness settle over you now. Let your shoulders soften, and let your thoughts grow dim and warm. The most violent world in the solar system will keep its watch without you, turning beneath the giant, glowing softly in the long dark. There is nothing left to understand tonight, and nothing left to hold. Let the moon burn on, far away and gentle, and let yourself grow heavy and still. Sleep well, and good night.